What is up, everybody? Welcome, duelists, to another video. We have a little bit of a different one today because I have invited a guest that might be a familiar face to some of you guys if you've been watching any of my reactions to any of his videos, and that is Elsie. Welcome, Elsie.
Hello.
We are going to talk about a concept that is almost treated as a slur in the Yu-Gi-Oh community for a lot of people, and that is rotation, which is something, of course, you as a not only Magic, but also a Magic player know a little bit about. And we're going to talk about whether Yu-Gi-Oh would benefit from having a rotation. Should it have a rotation? What are the pros? What are the cons? And try to reach some sort of conclusion there. You can introduce yourself a little bit. I'll give you some time to tell people what you usually do, because, I mean, I like reacting to it, but you probably know best what you do.
So I'm a newer YouTuber. I've done a bunch of stuff historically with trading card games, largely with Magic. So for a long time, I've been a Magic player, but more recently I got into playing Yu-Gi-Oh! And I kind of on a whim made a video about that went surprisingly viral. And then from there, I've been making a bunch of videos just about game design in the trading card game space with the lens of kind of like Yu-Gi-Oh! And Magic. And then the other games that I play a lot of are like Riftbound and Star Wars Unlimited are the other ones that I have like the most context for. But I've been having a really good time talking about these concepts. I will say, like, one of the things that I was like inspired to make the Yu-Gi-Oh video from was actually one of your videos talking about like the balanced state of Yu-Gi-Oh right before all of the bans for those floodgates, like that kind of pseudo emergency ban list that happened. I thought that video was like very cool, and it was like one of the things that I made me feel like, oh, maybe I should make a video talking about this kind of stuff.
Yeah, it's unfortunately sometimes the crash out ones are the ones that, you know, get the most views, but yeah. And I mean, as someone who loves Yu-Gi-Oh but also just loves trading card games in general, I've found it very fun to watch your videos in particular, because you are looking, of course, at the broader landscape of trading card games, not just one, like, here's the best decks for this game or whatever, but just rather overall game design aspects, which is something that I also love talking about on my stream. I love watching videos about it, and I also especially liked hearing like the perspective on Yu-Gi-Oh from someone who's just recently gotten into it, but like with a background from other trading card games. As much as the Yu-Gi-Oh community usually hates when other people talk about their game as if they know it, I personally find it very interesting. I think it's very, very cool. And so we wanted to do something together, and this one is going to be on my channel, but we are also going to have other discussions on other topics that are more suited for your channel. Link to your channel, of course, in the description down below for people to go check out your channel, and also check out the video that we are going to do over there. You, as the Magic player of us two, why don't you give us a little bit of a introduction into what rotation is, even, because some people probably don't fully understand it.
Yeah, I feel like it's the hard R in the Yu-Gi-Oh community.
Exactly.
Yeah, so rotation is basically the idea that not all cards are going to be legal at all times. In Magic, for a long time, the standard format was the main rotating format that people would play, and very approximately, cards are legal for around 2 years in that format. So when you have a rotating format, you have only cards from a certain number of sets, and there's a predefined cadence upon which cards rotate. Typically, when you have a rotation, you don't rotate every set that's in the format. So let's say you release 6 sets in 1 year and then 6 sets in the next year. After 2 years, you would rotate the sets from the year previous, and so you would only end up with the sets from year 2. The cadence is usually known. It's like a consistent cadence every time, so it's not like a surprise. You wake up and rotation has happened. It's like everyone is aware of what sets are going to be part of what rotation cycle. And yeah, that's the basic idea.
Yeah, and I mean, of course, there are different ways that you can make this happen in practice. I'm sure the Magic rotation is not the exact same as the Pokemon rotation, and so on and so forth. And it also often comes with the idea of having multiple formats in your game, which is obviously one of the things that Yu-Gi-Oh is notorious for not having, at least until they have introduced Genesis format, which we're not even sure yet if that's going to stick. Yu-Gi-Oh is basically a one format game. In theory, we have traditional format, but you know, that's not really something that people play. But Magic does have multiple formats. I think we're also probably going to talk about that later on in terms of, like, you know, might be a pro, might be a con of this entire concept.
Some points about it.
But in I guess at least as a baseline, it probably means you're going to have at least 2 formats. One that is the rotating format, and one that is like the timeless or whatever, the one where all the cards can be legal.
Yeah, and ironically, timeless is a Magic format. The one exception is
like
Pokemon.
For half of the English dictionary, you'd probably have a Magic format.
Yeah, if you pick a time word, it
Yeah.
might be a Magic format. Pokemon is the one exception where like there is technically a second format that's non-rotating,
Yeah.
but I think if you ask the Pokemon players, you would find that it is not really a format. Like
But I
they
remember they
basically
do have tournaments for it sometimes.
it exists. It is technically officially supported, but it
Yeah.
like doesn't really get played. Is like
Yeah.
my understanding. Like that
It's
standard
also
is kind of the way that you
it's
play
also, I
Pokemon.
think it's getting less and less popular over time because I mean the way it works is just it gets crazier over time. So like it just
Yeah,
becomes.
yeah, yeah. And I don't think there's that much effort made towards
Mhm.
balancing it either. Although that's just conjecture on my part. I haven't played enough Pokemon to say that for
I
sure.
think that's fair enough though. I think every time I hear or see of Pokemon, it's always the standard format and never the other ones, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, anyways, we're gonna work through some of the pros and cons for rotation and if it is something that would suit the game of Yu-Gi-Oh! And we're gonna draw some comparisons as well to these other card games and see where those concepts come into play. So why don't we begin with some of the things that rotation could add to the game? Why would you want rotation to be a part of any given trading card game to begin with?
Yeah, for sure. I think the big one, and this is the really obvious argument for adding rotation, is that it lets you get rid of problem cards without a banned list. So if you have
Mhm.
like cards that are too powerful or are creating degenerate play patterns, you don't necessarily have to immediately run to ban them. You can allow them to exist for a certain period of time, knowing
Mhm.
that they are eventually going to go away. And so you end up with situations where, like, yeah, maybe a format is defined by a couple of very powerful cards, but it's only going to be defined by those cards for 2 or 3 years at most, at which
Right.
point you'll have new things. I think that's like maybe the biggest argument for doing it
And that
is
is
power
a
level
fair
management.
point. However, there's a couple things I want to that I want to poke at because like 2 to 3 years is still a very long time. So I feel like
It is.
it still doesn't remove the issue of well, if a card isn't properly designed, you're still gonna have to deal with it for like 2 years, and then there's probably gonna be another card that's not well designed after that, and so on and so forth. So, and this is actually something that I was interested about when it comes to Magic, because Magic does have rotation, but Magic still has ban lists, right?
100%. And historically, so like historic also a Magic format. I'm not doing this on purpose, I promise.
No, I'm not gonna.
Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, historically, Magic has tried to keep the standard format as ban free as possible. It's like it's the format that they test and design around the most until quite recently. And as a result, while there have been standard bans, it's been kind of viewed as like a red alert, like this is really bad if we're banning cards
Hmm.
in standard. It means something's gone really wrong. But it does happen. And also relevantly, the standard ban list right now is 10 cards long, which is I think the most cards that have been on a standard ban list, certainly
Hmm.
in like decades. It's the most cards that have been on the standard ban list. And
Right.
so it does happen. You do still sometimes have to reach for the ban hammer, obviously, but
Hmm.
theoretically you shouldn't have to quite as often.
Right. Yeah. I quite like that idea of slowing down power creep in a very controlled fashion and also in a way that is neutral, quote unquote, right? There's no debate about which are the fun cards, which are the not fun cards, which are the ones that we need to get rid of, which are the ones that we don't need to get rid of. It's just every card is treated equally, everything is guaranteed to rotate out at a certain point, and people can also plan for it. And that kind of leads me into the next thing that I was going to ask you about, because one of my initial questions that I would have about rotation is like, does it do anything to card prices as well? Like, is it something that because people know a card is going to rotate in 2 years maximum, is that something that you feel like has an impact on the price of standard? Like, is standard cheaper because of it?
No,
No?
sort of. The answer is yeah. Like the answer is sort of.
Okay.
It is a situation where cards that are powerful in standard will often. It depends on the popularity, but when standard's very popular, the most playable and powerful cards in standard will still like spike to quite high prices.
Mm-hmm.
So like if you go look at like something like Quantum Riddler or Ledger Shredder was another example of these cards that were like very powerful in standard somewhat recently, Quantum Riddler right now even. These are cards that their price is like quite high because not only are they attractive to play in all of the eternal formats that exist in Magic, but they're also very good in standard or were very good in standard. And so
Yeah.
you now all of a sudden have like even more people competing for it.
Mm-hmm.
But in general, what happens is that prices on these cards tends to drop the closer they get to rotation.
Right.
And so it means that like kind of halfway through the cycle, a lot of the times the most powerful cards or the most playable cards from the early sets in the rotation cycle, those will start to slowly go down as people kind of sell off, knowing that these aren't going to hold their price forever. And then once cards rotate, their prices typically plummet, but that's obviously relational to the fact that you can now no longer play them.
Yeah, and that I wouldn't even count as a pro, because that's like, well, the card becomes cheap because now you can't play it anymore. The previous thing that you described of like the cards being expensive initially and then dropping maybe like a year later, that reminds me of Yu-Gi-Oh's reprint philosophy, where it's like, okay, cards are often immediately expensive when they come out, but then they will be reprinted. But then you are lacking the, well, this card now rotates and is now worthless, basically. So yes, in Yu-Gi-Oh, often if you spend a lot of money on a card that you currently need, eventually later down the line that will turn out as a, you know, you've lost money now because the card has now been reprinted, especially when it comes to meta staples, right? Of course, I'm not talking like investing into high rarity like staples or Time Wizard retro cards or something like that. I'm talking like if you want like a Pot of Sloth right now, right? Like a secret rare from the latest set that has meta impact. I think at the moment in Europe it runs you like 50 euros. And I don't expect that to be a positive investment later down the line. Like that is something that eventually we know this card is going to get reprinted and is going to be like a loss for people who keep it.
Yeah, and I would say like that experience is pretty comparable in Magic. Like investing into a standard deck shouldn't be viewed as investing, quote unquote.
Yes.
Like in Magic in the Eternal formats, you can oftentimes feel relatively comfortable buying into like certain staples, knowing that if you then sold them 3 years later, you're likely not selling them at a big loss. But in Standard, that's not the case. Like it's essentially like buying a car. Like the second you buy the Standard deck,
to play the game, right?
Value.
You don't invest.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, exactly. So it doesn't, I don't think, it's definitely not a pro. Like there's not some positive financial incentive behind having rotate.
Yeah, and I mean, I do care about the game balancing aspects of it way more. It's just something I wanted to bring up because I think it's something that does matter when, you know, cards become unplayable. It definitely does something to the value of it, right?
100%. I think, too, one of the big things that I wanted to talk about with why you would want to do rotation, and I think this is something that's particularly relevant in a Yu-Gi-Oh context, is when you have rotation and you know that cards are only going to exist in a format for a certain period of time, I think you kind of give designers more license to like get crazy and like do interesting and powerful stuff because they know that they're not necessarily printing these cards into a format for life. I don't know. Do you feel like that happens in Yu-Gi-Oh where like you sometimes feel like maybe they like don't make things quite as powerful as they could be because they know if they print like a powerful generic card, for example, even if it's not playable now, maybe in 5 years, Habakiri gets printed and King of the Pharaoh Limps breaks, for example, right? Like something like that.
Well, I mean, you just mentioned 2 exact examples of, well, of course they still do it. They don't care, I think. They just do it. And I mean, to be fair, Yu-Gi-Oh does have another system of getting rid of really problematic cards in the ban list, and we're going to draw a comparison later, but in theory, you would think like, yeah, if you don't have rotation, you have to be very careful with making cards, especially generic cards, because those are very hard to phase out. This is something that, you know, I've been on a crusade recently against like generic extra deck negates and generic extra deck monsters and like non-engine that goes into every single deck, right? It's something that shows very often in Yu-Gi-Oh that like these cards from 10, 15, 20 years ago still have the power to absolutely like ruin a format. I mean, Anti-Spell Fragrance was made in 2002, and that card is still,
that's crazy.
Yeah, that card is still ruining games to this day. But then again, like, I mean, you can solve this with rotation, you can solve this with a ban list as well. It's not that hard, but apparently it is. I don't know, but no, it doesn't stop the Yu-Gi-Oh designers from making crazy stuff because they keep making crazy stuff.
Yeah, because like theoretically, I think it should allow you to make these kinds of choices. Like in Star Wars, one of the games that I talk about on the channel somewhat frequently, they, in the very first set that they designed, Spark of Rebellion, like came out swinging, and they printed a bunch of like super powerful meta-defining staples named after the main Star Wars characters. So like think like Luke Skywalker and Darth Vader, like, and Boba Fett. Like these were like the most powerful cards in the game on release. And part of the reason why I think they felt like they were allowed to do that is that they knew that they were planning to introduce rotation and rotate these cards out after 2 years.
Yeah.
So we had 2 years where like Luke Skywalker was the best 7 drop to play, and that never changed. And if it had been a case where you were always going to be able to play him and their options were power creep him by printing a better card or ban him, I think that like it's potentially a bit more of like a negative state, but instead they just were allowed to make this card and then know that 2 years later it wasn't going to be in the format anymore and that was probably going to be okay.
Yeah, I mean, you can even argue that in Yu-Gi-Oh! They are even more incentivized or even more forced to go a little crazy about cards because they do need to make sure that new cards see play, right? And this is one of the main things when it comes to balancing is that, well, the main way Yu-Gi-Oh! Introduces new cards to the game and to its players is, well, these cards are better than what you had before, right? And without rotation, you never get that sort of like reset after 2 years where you go back to the power level from a while ago and you can like build upon that and make new archetypes that now work. And in Yu-Gi-Oh! Instead, you kind of have to just make them more powerful. There's no other way. I mean, we have the ban list, but the ban list is, in terms of the overall effectiveness, like it's just not that big. Like they could throw more cards on it, sure, but in reality, it's just not that large of a ban list. And the main way how Yu-Gi-Oh! Decks get replaced is by them making a more powerful deck. And, you know, of course, power creep is something that it's been working for Yu-Gi-Oh! For 25 plus years, but it's the question on my mind is always like, can it go forever? Like, is this something that, you know, we are at a point where one card does so much in Yu-Gi-Oh! Like 3 years down the line, like, 5 years down the line, like where do we go?
That's something I asked specifically with Cool Tune, actually, like where I was thinking like, okay, we're now at the point where we're like breaking the theoretical kind of rules of engagement for modern Yu-Gi-Oh, which is that like, I really like the way that you frame this, by the way. I know not everyone agrees with this framework of how Yu-Gi-Oh should work, but I agree with you that I think it makes a lot of sense for modern Yu-Gi-Oh to be like, player 1 builds a puzzle, player 2 tries to solve the puzzle, and then maybe we get more interaction after that, but like the core gameplay is that. It's turn 1, turn 2, and that's where you should be designing around. And like Cool Tune just like breaks that paradigm, and now, you know, obviously we're not going to spend forever talking about that one. Yeah, exactly. But it's like, where do you go from there? Like outside of just banning Cool Tune and like getting Rotary out of the game, like,
I mean, they just made a more powerful version of Cool Tune already.
I know, in Tune, right?
Yeah, the Tune deck does the same thing, but better. It just looks at your opponent's hand and gets to negate 2 cards from it right away.
Yeah, so it's like, at a certain point, like, you run out of runway, and rotation theoretically either lets you, like, build a new runway by rotating things out and saying, okay, we can start power creeping again, or it says, you can print these cards, but they will not exist.
Yeah, because the way I look at new design space in card games is, like, I think you can make players pick up new decks in Yu-Gi-Oh! In 2 ways. You can either make them, I don't know how to describe it, but if I'm looking at it from 2 axes, like you can either go vertical, like up, by making them more powerful, or you can go to the side, horizontal design, and make them different, like interesting in a way where like they're not necessarily better or worse, but they are just, they feel different, right? And interesting because of that. Like making a deck that's not necessarily broken, but just it's good too, maybe about the same power level ideally as the existing stuff, but fun in a different way, right? And I think Yu-Gi-Oh! Is often forced to design just up and up and up and up, where I would love to see them do more stuff like sideways. Like I would love to see more decks release at a similar power level, but just be very different and new and interesting. But I do also realize that that is much harder. It's much easier to just make a card broken than make it same power level but interesting.
I think, and in the Yu-Gi-Oh context in particular, it's challenging to achieve this kind of like horizontal design that you're talking about. Like the Justice Hunters format is probably the best recent one that we have, where there was like a real distinct, identifiable like difference between the top decks, but you could find reasons to play all of them. And I think that unlike that, like in games like Magic, it's a lot easier to convince people to try different things because you can offer a much different play style in terms of like how you're planning to win the game. So like you can tell people like, oh, you can play the mono red aggro deck, or you can play the blue white control deck, or you can play the mono green ramp deck. And all of these things are going to have like matchup tables that look a little bit different. They're going to be better into different metagames. And I think in Yu-Gi-Oh! Oftentimes the type of interaction that you have is not necessarily always dynamic enough to provide you with real good reasons to go one way or the other. It's oftentimes just,
Mm,
I want the most stuff I can possibly get. It's possible that's a
yeah.
whole different video for us to
That
talk
that
about. I don't know.
definitely is, because I mean we've already talked about this when we bounced ideas back and forth of like, you know, Yu-Gi-Oh combo mid-range control, the
Mhm.
kind of words that we use, and they're not really accurate for Yu-Gi-Oh decks. But I would still argue that there is a lot of differences in the way that Yu-Gi-Oh decks interact with each other. Like a combo deck like Elf Notes, it still feels very different in how it wins the game from something like Cool Tune or Draco Tail or Sky Striker or Branded. Like the decks do have differences in how they feel. That is definitely something we would need a whole like its own video to really iron out like how we would classify Yu-Gi-Oh decks. The thing that bothers me the most is the term combo deck, because technically almost every Yu-Gi-Oh deck is a combo
Yeah,
deck, but
yeah. It
that's
really
a
doesn't
different
fit.
story. And then most of the time the combos aren't even combos because it's just one card. But yeah, anyways. Um, back to
Yeah.
rotation. Yeah.
Yes, but I think rotation theoretically allows for that horizontal design.
Exactly.
You're talking about, I guess,
Rotation,
to tie it all back in.
rotation slows down power creep is, I think, a good way to put it. I think rotation slows down power creep, and that is, I feel like that can universally be seen as a good thing. I think it's hard to argue with that. Or at least I
It's
think
also
most people, especially when it comes to Yu-Gi-Oh and its power, like the one thing that most people tend to have an issue with a lot of the times is its power level. Whether that is
Yeah.
people that are not playing Yu-Gi-Oh, just looking at it from the outside, or used to play Yu-Gi-Oh and stopped because of it, or are still playing Yu-Gi-Oh, even the actively playing Yu-Gi-Oh, people are still like often mourning about the power level of certain things in the game, and we are just waiting for the next ban list to fix our issues, but we never know for sure if it's going to happen. And if we had a rotation, we would know that it would happen eventually, right? And I think this is, for me, it would be particularly appealing for something like non-engine and generic cards, because one thing that I always say is like, well, in Yu-Gi-Oh, the archetypes quote unquote rotate anyways, right? Like they just make more powerful decks, they throw a couple cards on the ban list, the deck still functions, but it's no longer the best deck, so people eventually at the high competitive level, they will stop playing it and you will see it less, right? That is the case for 90% of Yu-Gi-Oh decks. Of course, we have some decks that survive a longer time, like Branded is a recent example of a deck that just, it'll come back every time, but because they keep making more cards for it, to be fair. Like the version of Branded from 4 years ago would not be competitive today. It's just because they keep it alive. They make the decision to give that deck support. But those decks rotate. What doesn't rotate in Yu-Gi-Oh is non-engine. Anti-Spell Fragrance from 25 years ago. Max C in Master Duel, it was made 15 years ago, and so on and so forth. And very often in trading card games, you have this phenomenon where cards, when they come out, they're fine, but then they age poorly because the game develops, especially in a game with no rotation. So
Yeah. And I think the non-engine piece of this is, I think, one of the better arguments for rotation in Yu-Gi-Oh! And maybe we can talk about this and then we can talk about reasons to not rotate
yeah,
in Yu-Gi-Oh! Because I do think that there's a lot of those as well.
yeah.
But one of the big things that I like to think about is when you're talking about a TCG ecosystem, the bigger it gets, the harder it gets to kind of define the guardrails of what's going to keep everything in check. And I think as a result of Yu-Gi-Oh's kind of ecosystem being so big, there are so many cards, the
Mhm.
kinds of guardrails they're forced to print, and I say forced, I mean they chose to do it, but they're forced to print in order to theoretically create safety guards, are things like Droll and Lockbird and Dimension Shifter, these like incredibly oppressively obnoxious cards, Maxi, right? They're so powerful, but it's because they kind of almost need to be, in a way, because they need to catch all for any future design that they ever make. And if you had a smaller ecosystem that was created by a rotation, it would be a lot easier to create non-engine pieces and engines as well. I think that would fit into a more appropriate horizontal design box, and it would be easier to create, theoretically at least, metagames where you didn't have these guardrails that felt so oppressive like we have currently in the Yu-Gi-Oh metagames.
Yeah, and it often feels like it's used as a justification for making the new stuff so powerful, right? Where it's like, oh, well, you know, you can still beat it if you have Droll, or you can beat it if you draw more Charmy. Or like 5 years ago, it was like, well, you can beat it if you open Dark Ruler no more, or if you open Ibiru or whatever, then you're fine. But if not, well, you know. The question that people don't ask in that regard is like, how fun is the gameplay that stems from that, right? If you have these kind of like super powerful silver bullets, is like, yeah, on paper, if you just look at win rates and stats and everything, that works. Yes, this combo deck does have a moderate win rate, 50, 60%. Like it's acceptable in terms of that, but the game is not all just numbers, right? Like, because the
Yeah.
experience of players when they play the game and how they win or how they lose, I would argue does matter. Of course, it's very hard to capture this because it's very, very subjective, and you can't just point to it and say like this card is objectively fun or not fun. Of course, we have a feeling for it, but we never get to. With the Yugi community never agrees on stuff. Like, we can never 100% agree on it. But yeah, that just cycles back. The rotation would just be a neutral way of, we don't have to figure out, is this fun or is it not? It's just like, it's guaranteed to rotate out. It's like,
Yeah, yeah. And you can just create a box for here's what the format's going to look like without needing these kind of win rate cudgels of these lingering floodgates and other effects.
Right.
So do you want to talk about why you wouldn't want rotation, I guess? Because when we first started talking about this, like just conceptually as one of the videos we wanted to do, you said, when you summed up your position on it to me, you said that you were like, you think it would be good for the game, but you also think it can't ever happen and shouldn't ever happen. Do you want to kind of explain broadly maybe why that is the case?
We can go over some of the more, like, I think logical reasons why it wouldn't be, but the reason why I think it shouldn't happen is simply because I think the Yu-Gi-Oh community wouldn't accept it.
Yeah.
And I think that's, I don't mean this in a negative way towards the Yu-Gi-Oh community. I think this is reasonable because I think Yu-Gi-Oh has just shaped its position, or the way this game works as a card game in the card game industry is now very, very defined by the fact that it does have this kind of like infinite format where all the cards are legal. And one of Yu-Gi-Oh's main draws these days is that you can pick up a deck and you will eventually get legacy support, and it'll be the best set. Everyone has that one set from recent years where one of their favorite decks from a while ago got legacy support. Sometimes they get really good because of it, and sometimes they don't. Like, not every wave of legacy support is good, but essentially the way people play Yu-Gi-Oh now is they have their favorite decks from whenever you started. Some people started 2 years ago, some people started 10 years ago, some people started 20 years ago. It doesn't matter. But whatever favorite Yu-Gi-Oh deck you have, you can hope for legacy support for it, and you will eventually get it. Most archetypes get legacy support, sometimes even in multiple waves. Some decks got legacy support in 2020 and then got legacy support in like 2024 again, and so on and so forth, right? And this is something that I think is very core to the identity of the game now.
I think too, it's almost kind of like antithetical to the way that Yu-Gi-Oh is supposed to operate because it's so story driven, right? So it's like, I guess technically you could have a rotation where like only certain blue eyes monsters are legal at certain times or whatever, but it would feel weird. Like, it would feel weird to not be able to play them. And I think, too, on your point about, like, the community not accepting it, like, this happened in Magic as well. Like, Magic was not always a game that had a rotating format. In the earlier days of Magic, for the first 10 or so years, people just played with all of the cards. And then finally, they hit a balance state where they realized we need to create a separate format. And so for a long time, the Magic formats were called Type 1 and Type 2, and then there was Type 1.5. Type 2 is what we would now call Standard.
Okay.
But when that happened, like, that created a legitimate schism in the Magic community, and that still even persists today. There are really a myriad of Magic players, right? There are, aside from just like competitive and the casual divide, like even amongst competitive players, there are players who only play Legacy, which is Magic's eternal format where virtually every card is legal, and they wouldn't touch another format with like a 10.5-foot pole. And then there are people who only play Standard and Draft, and maybe they play Modern when it's the competitive format that's being like supported for the Pro Tour, and they wouldn't ever play Legacy. They don't ever want to go back and play that kind of format. So I'm very sympathetic to this idea. I think that if you tried to tell Magic's Legacy players, hey, we're going to introduce rotation to Legacy and we're going to chop out Force of Will, you can't play it anymore. I mean, like, there would be rioting in the streets.
And I guess that works as long as each individual community is still big enough, right? If there's enough people who love Standard and enough people who love Legacy, there's not really an issue with that. At the same time, it is a risk for a game to go down that route, and you never know what's going to happen if, a large portion of your community doesn't like the change. Because one of the things that happened in Yu-Gi-Oh, which definitely happened before you were around, is when they introduced like Link monsters for the first time, and they changed the rules of the game very, very fundamentally for them. Because before then, we didn't even have the extra monster zone, and so on and so. I'm not sure how familiar you are with how Yu-Gi-Oh worked before.
Master Rule 4, right? That's the
Master Rule
the
4 was what it's called when they introduced it first, yes. And it basically introduced the extra monster zone, and you could only summon extra deck monsters to the extra monster zone, and that back then included like Fusion, Synchro, XYZs. So you were basically limited to one XYZ monster on the field if you didn't use Link monsters. Like, you would have to summon a Link monster up there and then get more arrows and then summon the fusions and XYZs down there. And that essentially did basically kill every single Synchro Xyz fusion strategy that was planning on summoning multiple of them right off the bat. It essentially felt like a very much like you are forced to buy these new Link monsters. You cannot just play the game the way you liked to play it. You have to play this new mechanic, right? Because for something like Pendulum, for example, if there were people who didn't like Pendulum, they didn't need to play it, right? I mean, they'd have to play against it occasionally, but they never were forced to pick up and play a Pendulum deck. But if you played a fusion deck and Link monsters came out, you were forced to play Link monsters, because otherwise you get to summon one fusion monster, that's it. And yeah, I mean, that is essentially something that is emulating what rotation would do, is it would force you to play the game in a certain way, or it would force you to stop playing certain decks.
Yeah, it's almost identical, honestly. Like that. Yeah. That's a really good example of a situation. Now, I think one of the things that's going on there is that it wasn't really super well communicated. Like they just, because my recollection is like they just announced that this change was happening like alongside with the set drop, right? Like it's not like there was a lot of communication.
I don't remember the exact timing back then. It definitely was something that just like here the set came out and now this is how you have to play. They probably communicated it somewhat in advance, because it was probably in effect in the OCG months before it was for us. So we knew about it beforehand, but apparently this was something that was really, really bad for the game overall, because they went back on it really quickly in the grand scheme of things. I think it took a year or two until they made Master Rule 5, which essentially made it so that Link monsters and Pendulum monsters still work that way, but all the other ones you can summon wherever you want. And I think it was because, or what's said is that it was because they faced a lot of backlash about changing the game so fundamentally 15 years in, when a lot of people had developed these kind of like pet decks. And this is especially something that mattered for casuals more so than competitive players.
I can only imagine. Like if you spent like your whole Yu-Gi-Oh life being someone who really likes Raid Raptor, and then all of a sudden they tell you, well, now you need to be able to I don't know, that might be post Master Rule 4.
That's fictional too, because no one likes Raid Raptors, but yes, in theory.
Hey, I like Raid Raptor. That deck's cool. It's something you mentioned that I think is interesting here too, that is a reason to not do rotation in the Yu-Gi-Oh context, is the OCG as well, because the TCG OCG disconnected release cadence, like it's already awkward enough to manage from a logistics standpoint. But if you were also now needing to manage an OCG TCG rotation disconnect, like how do you do that? Do they just fully become different games? And I think that is what the answer would be. But like, would you rotate them on the same days? Like, would you have it offset? Like in Riftbound, for example, fun fact, like they didn't expect the game to be popular in the West. The game was basically developed and intended to be released in China. And then like they announced that they were making a trading card game in China, and like people in like Europe and North America were like, what the hell? Like, can we have this Riot card game, please? And so they had to like really quickly scale up to be able to create cards like in English at a higher rate. And so for the first 3 sets, there was a disconnect between the release cycle. China got the cards months before the West did. And like it was miserable. And I can only imagine what that would be like trying to manage on a much larger scale with something like Yu-Gi-Oh! Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and I think that also that kind of sums up why I feel like we shouldn't get it. Is I think from a competitive standpoint, rotation has a lot of cool things to it, and I think balancing and stuff like that is probably easier and better with rotation, or would be easier and better with rotation, but I think it excludes one of the most important things from Yu-Gi-Oh, which is a lot of the casual draw to the game, and I think that is very, very important.
I think there's something to be said too about like being able to, if you're like kind of like a hard crust gamer, this is a term that I heard kind of recently, which I kind of like, which is like not a hardcore player who's like playing 3 hours of Master Rule every day, like following all the tournament results, and not a casual player who like has no interest in competing. But if you're kind of in the middle where like, you know, you like picking up the odd set here and there, and you know, you get into a format and then you maybe don't play for a format or two, it's kind of nice that, you know, if you picked up Mitsurugi a year ago and you're getting back in now, I mean, yeah, like the ban list has adjusted how that deck looks, and you probably need to find a couple of replacements, but you can just jump back in and start playing. It's not as though you're immediately incapable of engaging with the game.
Yeah, it all circles back to that thing I said earlier about this is Yu-Gi-Oh's identity now. Yu-Gi-Oh decks rarely ever die anymore. This is something that used to happen more as someone who's played Yu-Gi-Oh for basically all of its lifespan. Back in my day, decks would decks would more often just die. They would just pull the trigger on a certain card and just ban it, and then the deck was gone again. Like, not always, but decks like the Dragon Rulers or Spell Books or something like these decks were super powerful. Let's get rid of them, and that's that. Nowadays, I feel like they barely do that anymore. I don't mean this in a positive or negative way, but it's just an observation that most decks from last year or 2 years ago, 3 years ago are technically still playable, and they're not even that bad. Because they still get access to the best non-engine in the game, and because they still, I mean, decks 2 years ago still made powerful boards. If they go first, or if they have the right non-engine, if the stars align, and so on and so forth, they will still be decent. Like, they're tier 2, tier 3, but most of them you can just still go and do well. People still do well with decks like Yummy, which has arguably been hit relatively hard on the ban list, but never killed, and you can still play it.
Yeah, I mean, they did have that brutal, what was it, one of the synchro monsters went to 1 for like no reason.
Yes, they're very brutal. They will never recover from the card that was only ever played at 1 copy.
Yeah. And the Arthalion to 2 on that same list also. Yep. Super high impact. Yeah, and I think that like that is ultimately, I think, the reason why you would not want to put in a like fully codified rotation into Yu-Gi-Oh!
Yeah.
The last thing, and I did a video about this on my channel, but I think we've kind of been alluding to it the whole time that we've been talking, but like Yu-Gi-Oh! Already does kind of rotate as well, right? Like, you don't necessarily need to codify it and have all these negative things that we've talked about happen to you. You can just do what they already do, which is like pseudo rotate the format with like better engines, better non-engines. Mm-hmm. I do wonder, like, from your perspective, do you think that there's an argument for them being more active about pseudo rotating non-engine, like just fully banning out non-engine pieces that have existed for too long, and like I don't know, like something like Super Poly or something like Ash. Ash is like a pretty contentious one, I guess, but yeah, like Super Poly, or like in 5 years, like or like in 5 years, like, do you think there's an argument for getting rid of the Charmies, for example, like just for the sake of opening up like metagame diversity, or maybe making space for other non-engine pieces? Or do you think that that's not something that's really feasible?
I personally look at it from a perspective of health of the game, essentially. And this is a very subjective way to look at it, but essentially I would want them to rotate out the ones that have aged poorly and now fulfill a different role. Like, for example, my take on Ash Blossom is the fact that it was once made as a hand trap to help the player going second, and I think nowadays, we can debate this another day, but I think nowadays Ash Blossom is a much more powerful card going first, because the decks have been optimized or power crept to a point where they play through Ash Blossom like it's nothing, and so they mainly use it to like counter Charmies, or if you don't have a Charmy, well, then have fun playing against full board plus Ash on top, and going second, having an Ash Blossom doesn't feel great anymore. So in my opinion, the card has aged poorly, and I think in cases like this, they should get rid of it and make a replacement for it that is more appropriate for the time. The same thing goes for a Droll and Lockbird, where a lot of decks these days have very good compromises against Droll and Lockbird when they go first, so Droll going second doesn't feel that amazing. I mean, it's good against some decks and good in some situations, but I think Droll going second is fine. But when the player going first has it on top of a board and the player going second tries to play into it, I think it's pretty bad when that happens. So a more appropriate version for modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Would maybe be something that has a clause on it that needs your opponent to control more cards than you do, or something like that. Something along those lines, right? There's different ways to do it. People have suggested a Molcharmy version of Droll, essentially, that draws you cards whenever your opponent searches, but you can only use it with an open board, like the Molcharmys, just as an example, right? I think that is something that I would like to see them do more in terms of non-engine. On the other hand, something like Super Poly, as long as the card is not crazy, overpowered, strong, develops bad play patterns over time, I think it's fine to keep it.
Yeah. It's just interesting because I think that, like, one thing that I kind of encountered as I was getting into the game was this idea of like, well, yeah, every time one of these powerful non-engine pieces has been printed, it's been a much more like powerful pseudo rotator than, say, like more powerful engines getting printed.
Yes.
And so like, I do wonder like if there's a better way that they could strike a balance between like finding ways to make the format change and be dynamic by printing like newer and more powerful engines without necessarily also printing these non-engine pieces that pseudo rotate a bunch of old things, you know, so that people really feel like they can't play them anymore.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that there's a lot of people who complain about this as well, where it's like, okay, well, I mean, from a competitive perspective, I'm a fan of Multrami Fuwalos. From a more casual perspective, I'm not, because I do realize that there's a lot of decks from 5 years ago or whatever who don't have good Multrami compromises, because a lot of the modern decks that they make now, they will have a fine plan under the Multramis, right? Because they are releasing in a time where those cards are already popular.
Yeah.
But the decks back then didn't. They didn't make those cards with Multrami Fuwalos in mind, so they don't have the little tricks up their sleeves of like, instead of summoning from the deck, you add them from the deck and then you get an extra normal summon or something. Or you add from deck and then special it from hand instead of just straight up specialing from deck. And so on and so forth. Like you said, a pseudo rotation that happens in Yu-Gi-Oh! Where the way that your old deck rotates, because, you know, here's the thing, we're talking about a company. They want your decks to rotate. They don't want you to play your deck from 5 years ago, right? That's the thing. They want you to play the new cards. And with no rotation in Yu-Gi-Oh! The way they do it is, well, they make Nibiru, and now your deck cannot be played. Like, you can play it, but you're going to lose to it every time you see it. Like, it's going to be a frustrating experience. And, well, here's a new deck that is just better into Nibiru now because, you know, it summons a monster negate on summon 3. And so go play that, right? It has its own set of pros and cons, I would say. To have
it's almost its own conversation, I think.
Yeah.
This idea of like,
and I think it comes down to this whole clash of, I like to look at ban lists or rotations as a tool of game balance, whereas for companies, very often it's just a tool of selling new cards, right? And that's where the two clash, right? It's like, yes, to sell new decks, all of it works, right? You can have a ban list and just ban some cards and make new non-engine cards that just beat the old decks and force people to play new decks that way. Or you could have a rotation. For them, it doesn't matter. For them, it's all the same. So they just do whatever they think works for their game. And I think for Yu-Gi-Oh!, I mean, like, they're not going to change the system 25 years in, I don't think.
No, yeah, I think that's right. I think ultimately, you know, for all the conversations about why you would want to have rotation or why it might be good and all of the positives of it, like, there are legitimate reasons why it's negative and why it wouldn't work. And I think ultimately those are going to win out.
Yeah. And
it is interesting.
Yeah,
oh, sorry. No, go ahead. I was going to say, it is interesting. Like, basically every new trading card game that gets designed now is being designed telling their players upfront whether or not it is a rotation game. Like, you don't have this kind of mystery. And I think basically every game has concluded that they would rather rotate. But I think that Yu-Gi-Oh! Is like one of these situations where they're pot committed at this point. They've spent all this time.
That's a good way to put it.
Not doing it, and you just can't change it now. It's too late.
And the thing is, like, to get some positive in here, I do think if used properly, the ban list is actually superior to rotation, even if you're looking at it through the lens of Yu-Gi-Oh!, but also just in general. In theory, if the ban list is used properly, and that is a big if, but it does offer all of the positives of rotation without any of the negatives, right? Like, you get to keep people's pet decks live, you get to keep all the cool stuff in the game, and you can select the cards that need to go. The only problem that comes with that is a super subjective selection process of like, what is too much, what isn't. And it's really hard. I wouldn't, whenever I make a ban list prediction, it's something that, you know, it's really hard to do. I wouldn't want to be in their shoes when you make a ban list for such a large community with so many different opinions where we can never agree on anything. And yeah, it's tough.
Yeah, and I think you're right though, that a ban list or even a points list in Genesis's case is actually like the better way to do it. You get way more
it's
value.
Harder. I think rotation is the easy way out in that sense.
100%. And in that sense, Yu-Gi-Oh! Is definitely doing something like unique and right. I think that one of the big tensions that you see too is like the communication about ban lists is not always tremendous from the Konami side of things. And so that leaves people wanting in that regard as well. They don't tend to like define what the expectations are going to be for like what the format looks like. But at the same time, like, you know, especially recently, I don't know exactly how you feel about this. I've actually felt like most of the ban lists have been like kind of good. Like, obviously there's some random things that you're like eyebrow raising and like, like, you know, like the Arthalion to 2 is like, what are we doing? And like the Yummy Monster that's only ever been played at 1 getting limited is kind of eyebrow raising, but like they're trying, I think, genuinely to make it so that, you know, some positives are changing, and I do think that they're getting to a bunch of the benefits without the negatives of rotation. Obviously, still more to do, and it could definitely be better. But I mean, that's going to be true of anything.
I think that's a fair thing to say, though. Yeah, it's something I've noticed as well in the last couple of years. The last ban list I wasn't a big fan of because it was lacking a lot of the non-engine stuff that I mentioned in this discussion as well. But the previous ones, I mean, we got the big Bloodgate one and some other stuff in the previous years. And I mean, there's always something that's not there. But overall, there has been a lot of good. The only thing I will say in that regard is with no rotation in place, you still have to have a certain pace of getting rid of problems, because if you print more problems than you get rid of, then you will still never reach that point of, you know, being,
you're eventually going to drown.
right? Exactly. That's why I'm like so like vocal about some issues, because I feel like if we don't catch up on issues from now, there's only going to be more entering the format. They never leave via rotation. If you don't have rotation, I think you have to be more aggressive with the ban list, which is something that is what I mean by if used properly. I think the ban list is a phenomenal tool. And I think right now it is unfortunately more used for the selling new decks aspect rather than actual
for the
balancing
pseudo
of the
rotation.
game, right?
Yeah,
I would like if both of those were equally important to them, and it just feels like the one is a little bit more important than the other. But to me personally, right? Of course, this is once again very subjective, and not everyone wants Ash banned, and not even everyone wants Droll banned, which is crazy to me. But yeah.
Yeah, very fair. It's a pretty interesting topic. I think
Yeah.
there's a whole other can of worms you could open talking about like points lists versus ban lists, but overall, I think we've covered it. I think we did a good job.
Okay. Yeah, so my conclusion, I guess, just to boil it down to one sentence again, I know I've said it before, but I think rotation from a competitive game balancing aspect is interesting and cool, but the ban list can also do the same thing if used properly. And I think the Yu-Gi-Oh community would respond very, very negatively to rotation because it has a lot of downsides that we brought up, and it kills a lot of strategies outright instead of just making them worse. And I think it's just not something that Yu-Gi-Oh should do, but it's interesting to think about. So is that what you would say as well, or do you have your own
I think
way
so.
of
I think
phrasing
you're right. I think it's a cool thought experiment, but ultimately, like, there's a reason why the word rotation is, like you mentioned, kind of a slur. It's just not something that would ever be accepted, and I think in practice is not something that you could ever really do.
All right. Well, then I thank you so much for joining me on this discussion, and I am very excited for future discussions that we're going to have on your channel as well, or maybe on this channel again. We'll see how this one is received. So if you guys are watching this on YouTube right now, make sure to, first of all, leave some love for LC. Check out his channel, drop a sub. He's been doing a lot of these game design discussions recently, and I've been enjoying them a lot. And also give me some feedback on how you like this, what you would like us to talk about on a potential future video, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I had a great time. This was awesome.
Yeah, I also had a very good time. So thank you all for watching, and we'll see you guys next time. Bye-bye.